Hello, I'm Chuck Phillip, and welcome to a Railroad Southern Stories. I already have one or two of these up, I think. And so we're approaching the Wrigley's Drawbridge. This is the last bridge you get to before you get to New Orleans. A lot of these bridges are pretty old, and a lot of them are tendered by bridge tenders. And so if there was any boat traffic down below, they'd open it up for them, and depending on who got there first, I'm assuming. Some of the engineers were good friends of these bridge tenders, and they would hook us up with sacks of oysters. But we had to use the ice machine down at the hotel to keep them cool until we could get back to Mobile with them. And so we're going across a defect detector here. There were several of these along the route. They all worked a little bit different than others before. Some were hot box detectors, others were just to tell you how long the train was, how many axles it had. This coming into Gentilly Yard here pretty soon, so it was really important to know how long the train was. But pretty much the tower or down, and also the dispatcher pretty much knew how long your train was, because they had to pretty much figure out what track they were going to put you in when you got to the yard. So, you know, this was a job that I worked from the 1996 to the early 2000s, and we went across a lot of swampland. And you really had to be dressed for survival doing this job, because not all these trains had wide body locomotives on them, you know, where they were air conditioned. This one here had no air conditioning. It was really loud. I had to wear earplugs a lot of the time that you were on there because of the horn and just that big diesel engine making all the racket it made. Had to turn the radio up really loud so you could hear that over that. So you can see all the swampland we're going over. This place is infested with alligators and water moccasins. I actually learned a lot about the behavior of water moccasins doing this job, because I would have to get out and walk this slag or to go back and do certain things with the train occasionally, and it was quite common to see water moccasins all up and down the main line. And I found out they wasn't near as aggressive as most people have been told they are. This is a train we're passing a siding here. And so we're going to wait for that's actually a local that's coming out right there. You can see the switchman up there, or the brakeman lining the switchback. But we would also be held out at a place called the Coffee House. It's actually the Folgers plant. And man, you could smell that coffee. I mean, it would really give you the fever for a cup. It smelled so good. And you wouldn't even call it that. When we got a stop signal there, we would call the dispatcher and say we're stopped at the coffee house, is what we called it. But there were a lot of industries that went between Mobile and New Orleans that was called a local, and I did work that some. And you just go between Mobile and New Orleans, you know, spotting these cars at these industries along the way, and you did it the reverse way coming back. But that was pretty much a regular crew that worked that. I pretty much worked an extra board where you were called as needed, so it's kind of like a first in, first out type of thing, and it looks like this car is going to barely get by there. I remember when I first started doing this job, I was nervous as a cat with a long tail crossing a wide road. I mean, all these cars just go right out in front of you, especially down through Gulfport, Biloxi, and after a while you just kind of get immune to it. And I have hit several cars doing this. Fortunately, none of the ones I hit were any fatalities. But that's just what it was. And, you know, this main line that went from Mobile to New Orleans was, I believe, built around 1866. It's been there a long time. In fact, the telegraph wires were still up during that time. I was working at the railroad, and they were still using that telegraph wire for the call boxes before they had the radios. So they were still being used at that all the way up, I think, to the early 80s. So I'm watching this train go by. I noticed that they had a couple of tank cars behind the locomotive. If they're empty, they could be there. If they're non-hazardous, they can be there. But if they are, they need to be at least 5 cars back. And so we're starting to approach. I'm looking at the aspect of this switch. That's one thing I was super OCD about, to make sure the switch was aligned correctly. You know, because if it wasn't, you could get on the ground, and I was real paranoid about that. So we're going to go through this switch here, and I'm making sure it's lined up there for the correct movement on the other side. as you run through the switch, you know, it might not derail when you go through it, but what'll happen if you make a reverse move back across and put you on the ground, or if another train comes through there going the opposite way, it can put them on the ground. I'm looking down there to see if I can see any alligators. Like I said, they're all over the place. Usually they would run off the rail when a train comes, but sometimes they would just sit right there in the middle of the track, and if they would just stay there, they would be all right. But what happens, to get really close, they'll open up their mouth real wide, and it would hit the top of the plow of the locomotive, and it would roll them up underneath the engine and cut them up. But if they were laying all the way across it, sometimes you'd see where it would cut them in half, and the head would be on one side of the track and the tail on the other. But usually they would get out of the way. You can see a lot of water moccasins, you know, out there in the middle of the track, especially if there's a lot of flooding or raining. They'd want to get up there. A lot of container yards going all up and down this way. Every time I got to this section of the track close to New Orleans, it reminded me of the song that Arlo Guthrie wrote to sing in New Orleans, and Willie Nelson also covered. And it goes like this. All along the southbound Odyssey, train pulls out of Kankakee, rolls along past houses, farms, and fields, passing trains that have no name, freight yards full of old black men, and the graveyards of the rusted automobiles. Good morning, America, how are you? Say, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train that called the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone 500 miles when the day is done. That's my attempt to imitate Willie Nelson, guys. And we had a lot of hobos, too, that would ride our trains. They'd actually get on cars, you know, and consist, and that's what they did. And come to find out, some of these hobos were actually, you know, wealthy people. They just liked riding trains. That's what they did on their vacations, was hop trains and run everywhere on them. I wouldn't do it, but there were some that did. I wouldn't, if they got on the locomotives, is when I would have to put my foot down and tell them to get off of those, but there's really no way you could keep them off your consist, and we pretty much had them on every train, and that's just the way it was. I'm assuming they probably still have these hobos riding them today. So I'm looking at the position of these switches. There's a church right there, and I never did see any services go on here, but I might not have timed it correctly when I went by these. Yep, it's kind of amazing to have a church right there about the rail yard. I mean, I can imagine, you know, trying to perform a service, and you got all this rail traffic out there beside it. And so I'm also looking at the switches ahead of us, make sure we're lined correctly. Now, a lot of times the yard master at Gentilly Yard would get the yard crew to line the switches for you, so we didn't have to stop the train for me to get out and line the switch, because they want to get these trains in the clear as quick as possible. And sometimes I can get on the frequency with the yard crews and ask them to do that as well. And so I think they're going to put us in track 8, but these tracks are numbered, and the track has to be large enough or long enough to hold your train as well. Sometimes your train was so long that none of the tracks would hold them, so you'd have to come in and make a cut and then shove the other track as well. But sometimes the Union Pacific would be picking up the train and just carry it on to their location as well. Now, usually if that was the case, we would take the train through Gentilly Yard and deliver it on the other side of the I-10 bridge there to what we call the UP side, and they would get on the train, or they'd have a crew meet us there. We'd get off, pick up the van. The van would take us to the hotel, or actually they'd take us back to the switch yard, and we'd log off of the computer there, and then from there we'd go to the hotel. And so we're coming around this corner here. Gentilly Yard was a very big switch yard. It was massive, and so we had a lot of railroads that intersected with this, not just Union Pacific. I think there's like 6 railroads that interchange with this hub. So it's not unusual to see Norfolk Southern, Illinois Central, and who knows how many others, even probably the short line railroads. That now there's someone working on this track there, and that was another thing you had to be mindful of too, is you cannot enter a track where it had what's called blue flag protection. It had a blue padlock on the switch and also had a blue flag on it, and you were not allowed to take that lock off or remove that flag. Only the person who put it there could take it off. There was a few times where they forgot to do that, and we were just stuck because we were not allowed by the rules to do it, and it really pissed off the yard master because he wanted to get you in the clear. And I can't blame him because we could get fired for doing that. It's a pretty strict rule they had. And so we pretty much come in here at a pretty slow speed, around 5 miles an hour, and we just kind of coast right on through. It'd take you a pretty good while just to get in the clear, because it's depending on how long your train was as well. That can take, a while getting all those cars back until you clear the switch back there, and sometimes the yard crew will let you know if you cleared it back there, because you didn't want to be hanging out on the switching lead either, because they got to be able to switch cars, and if you're in the way back there, they can't do it. That's my engineer there. I can't remember his name. He was a pretty cool cat that I can remember, because when you work an extra board, you never know what engineer you're going to have when you get called. And a lot of these guys had nicknames like Jughead and Glass Leg. I said, Glass Leg? What the heck? Well, he broke his leg several times on the yard. That's why they called him Glass Leg. So we all had nicknames. Mine was Chuck Roast. But, that told you they liked. If you had a nickname, they liked you. And so it's kind of an honor to have a nickname called Chuck Roast or Glass Leg or Jughead. There was another guy, switchman. They called him Boot Scooter. He liked to do all that country line dancing. There's the I-10 bridge going over the Mississippi River, and over on the other side of that would be where the UP yard is, where we deliver UP trains and also pick them up from over there as well. Now that's called the team track. That's where they fuel the locomotives, and I believe that's a tower up there right beside it. So a lot of times we'd cut off our trains, and we would cut off our locomotives and bring them over there so they could be serviced. And so what they had a service crew there. They would top off these tanks. I believe they held about 3,000 gallons of fuel, of diesel, and they would also clean the cab. They would clean we had a restroom on the locomotive. It's in the nose of it, and they would keep the ice chest full of water too there for the crews. And so they kept them up pretty well. It would be for the next crew that was going to get on them and make up the train to go back to Mobile. And so, from here we would go to the hotel at the day's end, and we would wait until we got called to come back out the next day to take one going back to Mobile. And so I've got another episode up if you want to see the day room. There we had one that we could hang out in, kill time, play poker. I had a pool table there. We really didn't have much as far as eating establishments around there. There was a Piccadilly and a mall across the road, and there was a Popeye's Chicken that was pretty close. They had something similar to a Waffle House that was in front of the hotel. It really wasn't that good, but a lot of times we'd have to eat there because that was just the closest thing to us. And we pretty much had a 2-hour call time, to go ahead and take our showers and get ready, get something to eat before we headed back out toward Mobile. I hope this has been informative, guys. Hope you've enjoyed this. I wish the video was better quality than what it is, but it's what it was. And I will probably put up a few more of these. I'm kind of sort of digging going back through these myself. Thanks for taking the time to watch this, and also thanks for subscribing to the channel too. I really appreciate it. And if you want to be notified when I put this next one out, there's a notification bell. Just click that, and it'll let you know when I put the next one up. Take care, guys. See you on the next one.